What happens when a baby chimpanzee wears clothes, sits at a table, and is held and rocked just like a human child? What happens when she is tested, taught, and measured, side by side with a human infant for 9 months straight? And what happens to the human child sharing that house? In 1931, a psychologist named Winthrop Kellogg and his wife Luella brought a 7.5-month-old chimpanzee named Gua into their home. Their son Donald was 10 months old. For the next 9 months, Gua and Donald were raised together, treated almost identically. Same rooms, same meals, same routines, same affection, same tests. What came out of that experiment was not what anyone expected. And the part nobody talks about is what happened after. The question the Kelloggs were really asking was one of the oldest in psychology: nature versus nurture. How much of who we are comes from our biology, and how much comes from the world we grow up in? In 1931, that debate was wide open. There were no clean answers. So they built one of the most unusual experiments in the history of developmental science. Gua was not kept in a cage. She wore a diaper. She sat in a high chair. She ate from a spoon and drank from a glass. She was held and tested alongside Donald every single day. The Kelloggs recorded everything: memory, balance, reflexes, emotional reactions, problem-solving, obedience. Every response from both subjects went into their notes. And at first, Gua was ahead. She walked steadily before Donald could. She climbed better. She responded to commands faster. She could follow instructions like "come here," "kiss," and "no," weeks before Donald showed the same understanding. She opened doors. She recognized daily patterns. To anyone watching from the outside, she looked almost like a very unusual toddler navigating a human household. This was exactly what made the experiment so striking. It seemed to suggest that environment was enormously powerful. A chimpanzee, raised in a human home from infancy, was learning things a wild chimpanzee would never learn. She was adapting. She was copying. She was, in some measurable sense, fitting in. If you find this kind of story fascinating, leave a comment below with a question you want answered about animal cognition or animal experiments. I read every one. But there was one wall Gua could not cross: speech. And this was not a matter of intelligence. Chimpanzees are genuinely intelligent animals. They use tools, form alliances, remember faces, solve problems, learn from watching others. But human spoken language depends on very specific anatomy. The vocal tract, the larynx, the precise neural architecture for producing and sequencing sounds. Chimpanzees do not have that hardware. Gua could connect certain sounds with certain actions, but she could not produce human words. And in a household built around language, that gap widened every week. Then something strange started happening on the other side of the experiment. The Kelloggs had been watching whether Gua could move toward Donald. But Donald began moving toward Gua. He started copying her sounds, the barks and food calls that chimpanzees use. He used gestures where words would normally come. He imitated her movements. By around 19 months, Donald's vocabulary was noticeably behind where it should have been for his age. The child who was supposed to be the baseline was being shaped by his companion just as much as she was being shaped by him. Both young minds were plastic. Both were absorbing the environment around them. The difference was that Gua was hitting biological limits on how far she could go, while Donald still had time to catch up once the conditions changed. After 9 months, the Kelloggs ended the experiment. The official reason was concern for Donald's development. Gua was sent from the family home to a private facility. She was 3 years old when she died, from a cause unrelated to the experiment itself. Donald went on to develop normally. He grew up, completed his education, and became a man. In 1973, at the age of 43, he died by suicide. The circumstances of his life were complex, and there is no evidence connecting his childhood experience to that outcome. It is mentioned here simply because it is part of the record, and because both Donald and Gua deserve to be remembered as more than data points. The Kellogg experiment did not end in 1932. It opened something. In 1966, a researcher named Alan Gardner and his wife Beatrix began raising a chimpanzee named Washoe from infancy, teaching her American Sign Language instead of spoken words. By age 4, Washoe had learned over 100 signs and could combine them to form simple phrases. She once signed "waterbird" when she saw a swan. She taught some of those signs to her own adopted son without being prompted. In 1973, a Columbia University team began a project with a chimpanzee they named Nim Chimpsky. The name was a direct nod to the linguist Nim Chimpsky, who had argued that language was uniquely human. Nim learned more than 100 signs over several years, but researchers eventually concluded that much of what Nim produced was sophisticated imitation rather than genuine grammar. He was combining signs, but not constructing new meaning the way a human child does. Then there was Kanzi, a bonobo who learned to communicate using a board of lexigrams, symbols that represented words and concepts, not by being formally trained, but by watching his mother's sessions and picking it up on his own. By adulthood, Kanzi had a working vocabulary of several hundred symbols and showed some understanding of spoken English sentences. Each of these experiments came back to the same unresolved question. Apes can acquire symbols, they can use them. But whether that is language or something else entirely, something that looks like language from the outside, that question is still genuinely open. What is striking is not how far the chimpanzees fell short. It is how the experiments kept revealing something about the humans involved. Every researcher who raised a chimpanzee in close contact reported the same thing. You stop being a neutral observer. The relationship becomes something real. And when the experiment ends, the separation is not clean for anyone. The Kellogg experiment was not designed to be cruel. Winthrop and Luella genuinely cared for Gua. They fed her, held her, played with her, and watched her closely for 9 months. But the experiment was designed around a question, and when the question became uncomfortable, the question was set aside and Gua was sent away. That is what modern research ethics tries to prevent. Scientists now must account for the long-term welfare of every subject. The harm caused by removal from an environment an animal has adapted to. The psychological cost of attachment and separation. The Kellogg study sits at the origin of those conversations. There is a deeper thing the experiment showed, though. Not that a chimpanzee can become human with enough nurture. It showed the opposite. It showed that what makes a human human is not just biology or just environment. It is the combination of both. The long, slow development of a brain that is built to soak in language and culture over many years. Gua's early motor advantages were real, but Donald's slower timeline was, in a sense, the point. A human infant develops slowly because that slow development is what builds the kind of mind that can hold a concept, connect it to a word, and pass it forward to the next generation. Gua was not a failed human. She was a chimpanzee, and by any fair measure, she was extraordinary. She adapted to a world that was not built for her, and she did it with intelligence and with what looked, to the people who raised her, very much like personality. What the Kellogg experiment was really asking was whether becoming human was the measure of worth. 90 years later, we are still figuring out that the answer is no. If this kind of story is what you come here for, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Every video on this channel starts with a real experiment, a real question, and an answer that is usually more complicated than it first appears.